Welcome to English Practice Every Day. Today we will explore the many meanings of the word fine, which can be used as a noun, an adjective, and a verb in various contexts. We will master this word by using simple sentences to understand all its meanings. Additionally, we'll explore how fine is used in idiomatic expressions and phrases. After our practice, we will read out loud a short story that uses the word fine in all the contexts to better understand its usage. Let's start. Please speak out loud with me as we practice. Word fine as a noun. Word fine as a noun means a penalty or payment for breaking a rule or law. Fine as a noun means a penalty or payment for breaking a rule or law. Joe had to pay a fine for speeding. Joe had to pay a fine for speeding. There's fine for parking here without a permit. There's a fine for parking here without a permit. Jane paid the library fine for returning the books late. Jane paid the library fine for returning the books late. The company paid a heavy fine for violating safety regulations. The company paid a heavy fine for violating safety regulations. Word fine as an adjective. Word fine as an adjective, first meaning is very good or excellent in quality. Fine as an adjective means very good or excellent in quality. Liz has a fine taste in art and design. Liz has a fine taste in art and design. The restaurant serves fine Italian cuisine. The restaurant serves fine Italian cuisine. Sam is a fine example of a dedicated teacher. Sam is a fine example of a dedicated teacher. That was a fine performance by the orchestra. That was a fine performance by the orchestra. Second meaning of fine as an adjective is thin, delicate, or small. Fine means thin, delicate, or small. Sophie's hair is soft and fine. Sophie's hair is soft and fine. The fabric is so fine, it feels like silk. The fabric is so fine, it feels like silk. The necklace was made of fine gold. The necklace was made of fine gold. The artist used a fine brush for the details. The artist used a fine brush for the details. Third meaning of fine as an adjective is being satisfactory or in satisfactory condition. Fine means being satisfactory or in satisfactory condition. The weather is fine today. The weather is fine today. The hotel is fine for a short stay. The hotel is fine for a short stay. You don't have to worry, I'm fine. You don't have to worry, I'm fine. The cake didn't rise, but it still tastes fine. The cake didn't rise, but it still tastes fine. Fourth meaning of fine as an adjective is very sharp or minutely precise. Fine means very sharp or minutely precise. Alex has a fine sense of humor. Alex has a fine sense of humor. The scientist showed a fine attention to detail. The scientist showed a fine attention to detail. The chef has a fine hand when seasoning dishes. The chef has a fine hand when seasoning dishes. Rose made a fine distinction between the two concepts. Rose made a fine distinction between the two concepts. Fifth meaning of fine as an adjective is light, not thick or heavy. Fine means light, not thick or heavy. Beth drew a fine line on the paper. Beth drew a fine line on the paper. It was a fine drizzle, not a heavy rain. It was a fine drizzle, not a heavy rain. A fine mist settled over the fields in the early morning. A fine mist settled over the fields in the early morning. The curtains are made of a fine fabric that lets in just enough light. The curtains are made of a fine fabric that lets in just enough light. Sixth meaning of fine as an adjective is smooth to touch, referring to substances consisting of relatively small particles. Fine means smooth to touch, referring to substances consisting of relatively small particles. There is a fine layer of dust on the shelf. There is a fine layer of dust on the shelf. The flour needs to be ground into a fine powder. The flour needs to be ground into a fine powder. The potter used fine clay to create the delicate vase. The potter used fine clay to create the delicate vase. After sifting the sugar, it had a fine texture, perfect for baking. After sifting the sugar, it had a fine texture, perfect for baking. Word fine as a verb. Word fine as a verb means to impose a monetary penalty. Fine means to impose a monetary penalty. The police fined Tom for speeding. The police fined Tom for speeding. Littering in this area could get you fined. Littering in this area could get you fined. The driver was fined for not wearing a seatbelt. The driver was fined for not wearing a seatbelt. Companies can be fined for not following regulations. Companies can be fined for not following regulations. Idioms and phrases with fine. 1. Cut it fine. Cut it fine means to leave very little time to do something. Cut it fine means to leave very little time to do something. We are cutting it fine if we want to catch the train. We are cutting it fine if we want to catch the train. 2. A fine line. A fine line means a very small difference between two things. A fine line means a very small difference between two things. There is a fine line between confidence and arrogance. There is a fine line between confidence and arrogance. 3. Fine feathers make fine birds. Fine feathers make fine birds means appearances can be deceptive. Fine feathers make fine birds means appearances can be deceptive. Just because Leo dresses well doesn't mean he is trustworthy. Fine feathers make fine birds. Just because Leo dresses well doesn't mean he is trustworthy. Fine feathers make fine birds. 4. In fine fettle. In fine fettle means in good health or condition. In fine fettle means in good health or condition. The old man was in fine fettle after his morning walk. The old man was in fine fettle after his morning walk. 5. Fine by me. Fine by me is used to agree to something. Fine by me is used to agree to something. If you want to go to the beach, that's fine by me. If you want to go to the beach, that's fine by me. That's the end of our practice. Let's now read out loud a short story that uses the word fine in all its various contexts. Title of the story: A Fine Day for Adventure. Emma woke up to a fine drizzle tapping on her window. She stretched and looked out at the fields shrouded in a fine mist. The weather is fine, she thought. A perfect day for some adventure. Emma had always loved her small town. It was known for its fine Italian cuisine and artisan shops selling goods like fine silk scarves and fine gold jewelry. Today she decided to visit the town's art exhibit, showcasing works by local artists. As she entered the gallery, she marveled at the paintings. Each had been created with a fine brush, capturing fine details that made the scenes come alive. One painting, of a fine line separating the sea from the sky, particularly caught her eye. "Isn't it lovely?" said a voice behind her. It was Mr. Carter, the gallery owner. "This piece is a fine example of modern art. The artist has a fine sense of humor too. You'll notice the playful elements if you look closely." Emma nodded, appreciating the work. "It's really fine, Mr. Carter. Thank you for pointing that out." After leaving the gallery, Emma strolled through the marketplace. Vendors called out, offering fine fabrics, freshly ground fine flour, and pottery made from fine clay. She bought a small vase, delighted by its smooth texture. Her peaceful morning was interrupted by a commotion near the town square. A police officer was writing a ticket for a man who had parked illegally. "You'll have to pay a fine, sir," the officer said sternly. The man grumbled and accepted the ticket. Emma overheard another passerby say, "He's lucky he didn't get fined last week for speeding." Emma shook her head and walked on. At lunch, Emma met her friend Sarah at a cafe. They laughed over their meals and reminisced about their childhood. "You know," Sarah said, "there's a fine line between bravery and recklessness, and you always manage to walk it." Emma laughed, "And you always cut it fine with your punctuality." Their conversation turned to the upcoming town festival. "Should we wear something special?" Sarah asked. "Well, as they say, fine feathers make fine birds," Emma joked. "Let's dress up a little." Later that evening, Emma returned home, feeling tired but happy. Her neighbor, Mr. Jenkins, was outside tending to his garden. "You're in fine fettle, Mr. Jenkins," she called out. He smiled. "A morning walk and a little gardening keep me going," he replied. Before heading inside, Emma checked her mailbox and found a flyer. It warned about a new law with hefty fines for littering. "Guess I'd better remind Sarah to clean up after our picnic tomorrow," she thought. As the day ended, Emma reflected on how a single word, fine, could mean so many things. The weather had been fine, the art was fine, and the vase she bought had a fine texture. Even the officer had fined someone. With a smile, she whispered, "That's fine by me," and drifted off to sleep, dreaming of her next adventure. End of story. That's all for today's vocabulary practice session. Please take some time to review this video and master the word fine in all its meanings. Bye for now.